When my coworker stopped by my house unexpectedly, she said, "Your wife asked me to help her disappear, and I think you should know why." Diane was standing on my front porch at 8:30 on a Friday evening, her hands shaking as she clutched her purse strap. I'd worked with her for 3 years at the accounting firm, where we both handled corporate tax audits, and in all that time, I'd never seen her outside the office except at the annual holiday party. She'd never been to my house. She'd never met my wife Simone, but here she was, her face pale in the porch light, telling me something that made no sense. I asked her to repeat what she'd just said, because I must have heard wrong. Diane looked past me into the house and asked if Simone was home. I told her no, my wife was at her book club like she was every Friday evening, and I asked again what she was talking about. Diane stepped closer and lowered her voice, saying we needed to talk somewhere private, because what she had to tell me would change everything I thought I knew about my marriage. My stomach dropped in that sickening way it does when you sense disaster approaching but can't yet see its shape. I'd been married to Simone for 9 years, together for 12, and I thought I knew her better than anyone. We'd met at a mutual friend's wedding where we were both part of the bridal party, and we talked all night about our shared love of hiking and old movies and cities we wanted to visit. She was smart and funny and beautiful in an understated way that made her more attractive the longer you knew her. We bought our house in the suburbs 5 years ago, a modest 3-bedroom colonial with a fenced backyard where we'd talked about eventually getting a dog once our schedules settled down. Simone worked as a project manager for a tech company, managing software development teams and bringing home stories about difficult clients and impossible deadlines. We had Friday date nights when her book club wasn't meeting, Sunday morning pancakes, inside jokes that had accumulated over a decade together. Our marriage wasn't perfect, but whose was? We argued sometimes about money or whose turn it was to clean the garage or whether we should finally commit to having kids, but nothing that seemed serious or unsolvable. I trusted her completely, never questioned where she was or who she was with, never felt that creeping suspicion that something was wrong beneath the surface of our daily routine. Diane followed me into the living room, and I gestured for her to sit on the couch while I took the armchair across from her. She perched on the edge of the cushion like she might need to run at any moment. I asked her how she even knew Simone, and Diane explained that they'd met at a women's professional networking group 6 months ago. They'd hit it off and started meeting for coffee occasionally, just friendly conversations about work and life. 2 weeks ago, Simone had asked to meet at a coffee shop downtown instead of their usual place near the office. During that meeting, Simone had told Diane she needed help with something sensitive and asked if Diane could keep a secret. When Diane agreed, Simone explained that she was planning to leave her husband and start over somewhere new, but she needed to do it in a way that made it look like she'd vanished without a trace. She wanted Diane's help setting up a new identity, finding a place to live in another state, maybe even creating a paper trail that would point authorities in the wrong direction if anyone came looking for her. I felt my hands go numb as Diane talked. I asked why Simone would want to disappear instead of just filing for divorce like a normal person, and Diane said she'd asked the same question. Simone had gotten vague and emotional, saying it was complicated, that I wouldn't let her go peacefully, that she was afraid of what might happen if she tried to leave through normal channels. Diane said alarm bells had started ringing in her head at that point because Simone was implying I was dangerous or controlling, but Diane had worked with me for 3 years, and I'd never shown any signs of violence or instability. Still, Diane had played along, asking what kind of help Simone needed. Over the next 2 weeks, Simone had sent Diane a series of texts and emails outlining her plan. She wanted to withdraw cash gradually from their accounts, buy a used car with cash in someone else's name, and drive to a city in another state where she'd already arranged temporary housing through an online contact. She wanted to leave her phone behind, cut all ties with friends and family, and essentially become a ghost. She'd asked Diane to receive mail at her address, to provide a fake reference for a rental application, to wire money to an account Simone had set up under a pseudonym. Diane pulled out her phone and showed me screenshots of text messages from a number she said belonged to Simone. The messages were detailed and specific, discussing logistics and timing and contingency plans. There were mentions of needing to do this before he noticed anything was wrong, references to being careful about leaving digital footprints, instructions for communicating through encrypted apps. I read through message after message, my disbelief turning to confusion and then to creeping dread. The writing style sounded like Simone, casual and organized, with her characteristic way of ending texts with a dash instead of a period. But the content was insane. Why would my wife be planning to vanish? Why would she paint me as some kind of threat she needed to escape from? I asked Diane why she was telling me this, and she said because the more she thought about it, the more wrong it felt. If I was really abusive or dangerous, Simone would have gone to the police or a domestic violence shelter, not asked a casual acquaintance to help her commit what amounted to fraud and identity theft. Diane said she'd done some research on spousal disappearances, and they often preceded false accusations or financial crimes. She thought I deserved to know what my wife was planning before it was too late to protect myself. I thanked Diane for coming forward and asked her not to tell Simone we'd spoken. She agreed and said she'd keep playing along with Simone's requests to see what else she could learn. After Diane left, I sat alone in my living room trying to process what I'd just heard. My first instinct was to confront Simone the moment she got home from book club, to demand an explanation for this insane plan, but something stopped me. If Diane was right and Simone was setting me up for something, confronting her prematurely might just accelerate whatever she had planned. I needed to think strategically, to gather evidence and understand what was really happening before I made any moves. I looked around our living room at the photos on the walls, pictures of us at our wedding, on vacation in Colorado, at her parents' anniversary party last year. In every photo, Simone was smiling, her arm around me, looking happy and content. Had she been faking it the whole time? Or had something changed recently that I'd been too oblivious to notice? I went upstairs to our bedroom and opened Simone's laptop, which she usually left on her nightstand. She'd never been secretive about her passwords, and I'd never had a reason to snoop before, but now I needed to see if there was any evidence of what Diane had described. The laptop opened to her email inbox, and I spent the next hour searching through messages looking for anything suspicious. Most of it was mundane work correspondence, promotional emails, exchanges with her sister about their mother's birthday plans. But then I found a folder labeled Personal Projects that contained a series of emails to and from addresses I didn't recognize. One thread was with someone named Jay Mallory discussing residential opportunities in the Pacific Northwest. Another was with a financial advisor about opening an account that wouldn't be tied to my name or our joint assets. A third was with someone who appeared to be helping her obtain documents under a different name. The emails were careful and coded, never explicitly stating what they were really about, but the implications were clear. Simone had been planning this for months, maybe longer. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely navigate the trackpad. I took screenshots of everything I could find and emailed them to my personal account, then closed the laptop and put it back exactly where I'd found it. I heard the garage door opening downstairs and knew Simone was home from book club. I forced myself to breathe normally, to compose my face into something neutral, to act like everything was fine. She called out my name as she came through the door, her voice bright and casual, asking if I'd had dinner yet. I came downstairs and told her I'd eaten a sandwich earlier, and she said she was starving because book club had run late and they'd only had wine and cheese. She kissed me on the cheek and started pulling leftovers from the refrigerator, chatting about the book they'd discussed and how one of the women in the group had announced her pregnancy. I watched her move through our kitchen with the easy familiarity of someone who'd done it 1,000 times, and I couldn't reconcile this normal domestic scene with what Diane had told me and what I'd found on her computer. Over the weekend, I pretended everything was normal while my mind raced through possibilities and scenarios. Simone seemed relaxed and happy, suggesting we drive out to that farmer's market she liked and then catch a movie in the evening. We spent Saturday wandering through vendor stalls buying fresh vegetables and homemade bread, and she linked her arm through mine and talked about maybe planting a vegetable garden in the backyard next spring. Sunday morning, we made pancakes together like always, and she teased me about using too much butter in the batter. If she was planning to disappear, she was hiding it perfectly. Or maybe I'd just never paid close enough attention before to notice when she was performing happiness instead of actually feeling it. On Sunday afternoon, while Simone was taking a shower, I went through her purse and found a receipt from a storage unit facility dated 3 days earlier. The receipt showed she'd paid for a 3-month rental on a 10-by-10 unit across town. I took a photo of the receipt and put it back, my heart pounding. Monday morning, I called in sick to work and drove to the storage facility. I told the attendant at the front desk that my wife had rented a unit, but I'd forgotten the number. And after checking my ID against their records, she gave me the unit number and directions to the correct building. I walked down the rows of identical orange doors until I found Unit 23B. The door was secured with a combination lock, and I spent 20 minutes trying different number combinations based on significant dates in our relationship before giving up. I couldn't get in without breaking the lock, and I wasn't ready to show my hand that obviously. I drove back home feeling frustrated and anxious, knowing Simone was hiding something in that storage unit but unable to access it. When Simone got home from work that evening, she asked if I was feeling better and said I looked pale. I told her I'd had a stomach bug but was on the mend, and she made me chicken soup from scratch and brought it to me on the couch with crackers and ginger ale. Her tenderness felt like cruelty now, knowing what I knew. The next morning, I called my brother Liam, who was a criminal defense attorney in the city. I explained the situation in broad strokes without revealing all the details I'd discovered, asking what my legal options were if my spouse was planning to disappear. Liam was quiet for a long moment, then asked if I had any evidence of adultery, financial fraud, or plans to harm me. I said I wasn't sure yet. I was still gathering information. Liam told me to document everything I could find, take photos and screenshots, preserve any physical evidence, and consider hiring a private investigator to fill in the gaps. He said that if Simone was planning to vanish and potentially accuse me of something to cover her tracks, I needed to have ironclad proof of my innocence and her deception before anything went public. He gave me the name of an investigator he'd worked with on other cases, a woman named Corinne Fletcher, who'd spent 20 years with the FBI before starting her own firm. I called Corinne that afternoon and scheduled a meeting for the following day. Corinne's office was in a professional building downtown, and when I arrived Wednesday morning, she greeted me with a firm handshake and direct eye contact that immediately put me at ease. She was in her mid-50s with steel-gray hair cut short and an air of competence that suggested she'd seen everything and wouldn't be shocked by my story. I laid out everything I knew: Diane's warning, the emails I'd found, the storage unit, the pattern of careful planning that suggested Simone had been working on this for months. Corinne took notes on a yellow legal pad, occasionally asking clarifying questions about dates and specific details. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and said this sounded like a classic setup for either financial fraud or false accusations, possibly both. She'd seen cases where a spouse fabricated evidence of abuse or created a narrative of being in danger to justify theft of assets or to establish grounds for an advantageous divorce settlement. In extreme cases, spouses had framed their partners for crimes to eliminate them as obstacles while claiming victim status. Corinne said she could conduct surveillance on Simone, track her movements, identify any unknown associates or accounts, and try to determine the full scope of what she was planning. Her fee was $200 per hour plus expenses, which felt steep but necessary. I authorized her to proceed and signed a contract that afternoon. Corinne said she'd start immediately and would report back within a week with her initial findings. I went home that evening and had dinner with Simone, who chatted about a difficult client meeting she'd had that day and asked if I wanted to go hiking that weekend since the weather was supposed to be nice. I agreed, and we planned a route through the state park we'd visited on our anniversary 2 years ago. Sitting across the table from her, I felt like I was looking at a stranger wearing my wife's face, and I wondered how long she'd been playing this role of the happy, devoted wife while secretly dismantling our life together. Thursday evening, Simone told me she needed to run some errands after work and would be home late. I told her that was fine and settled in to watch a game on TV, but as soon as she left, I called Corinne and told her Simone was on the move. Corinne said she already had an associate tailing Simone and would let me know what they found. 3 hours later, Corinne called back and said Simone had driven to the storage facility, spent 90 minutes inside the unit, then driven to a law office downtown where she'd met with an attorney named Gregory Ashford for another hour. Corinne's associate had photographed Simone entering and leaving both locations. I asked Corinne to find out what kind of law Gregory Ashford practiced, and she called back 20 minutes later to say he specialized in family law and domestic violence cases. My stomach turned. Simone was building a case against me, creating a narrative that would justify her disappearance and possibly destroy my reputation and freedom in the process. Friday morning, I took a personal day from work and drove to a different storage facility on the other side of town. I rented my own unit under my name alone and spent the next several hours moving important documents, financial records, backup drives with photos and videos, and anything else I thought might be valuable evidence or vulnerable to tampering. I made copies of our tax returns going back 10 years, printed out bank statements showing normal spending patterns with no evidence of abuse or control, gathered photos and videos from our marriage showing happy times and normal interactions. I wanted a complete record of our actual relationship, preserved somewhere Simone couldn't access or alter it. That evening, when Simone came home from work, she seemed distracted and tense. She picked at her dinner and said she had a headache, then went to bed early without her usual routine of reading or watching TV. I stayed downstairs and went through more of her emails on her laptop, finding additional communications with Gregory Ashford discussing documentation and establishing a pattern and building a timeline. Saturday, we went on our planned hike through the state park. The trail was beautiful, winding through pine forests and alongside a creek that sparkled in the autumn sunlight. Simone seemed more relaxed outside, pointing out birds and wildflowers, laughing when she slipped on a muddy patch and I caught her arm to steady her. For a few hours, I could almost forget that she was planning to destroy my life. We took a selfie at the summit overlooking the valley, both of us smiling with the landscape stretched out behind us, and I saved that photo knowing it might be one of the last normal moments we'd have together. On the drive home, Simone reached over and squeezed my hand and said she loved me. I said I loved her too, and I meant it despite everything, which made the betrayal hurt even more. How could someone who claimed to love me be capable of this level of deception? Monday morning, Corinne called and asked me to come to her office immediately. She had something I needed to see. I drove over during my lunch break and found her waiting with a thick folder of documents and photographs spread across her conference table. She'd managed to obtain surveillance footage from the storage facility showing what Simone had been putting into her unit over the past 2 months. The footage was grainy, but clear enough to identify dozens of boxes being loaded in, furniture including what looked like a desk and filing cabinet, and several large duffel bags that appeared heavy based on how Simone struggled to carry them. More disturbing was the evidence Corinne had gathered about Gregory Ashford's other clients. He represented women in high-conflict divorces, specializing in cases involving allegations of domestic violence, and his track record showed he was aggressive and willing to pursue criminal charges against husbands based on circumstantial evidence and client testimony. Simone was building a case with a lawyer who knew how to weaponize the legal system. Corinne said she'd also tracked down Jay Mallory, the person Simone had been emailing about residential opportunities in the Pacific Northwest. Jay Mallory turned out to be Julia Mallory, a property manager in Portland who specialized in helping women relocate quietly, often as part of domestic violence situations. Julia ran a network of safe houses and transitional housing, legitimate services for women genuinely fleeing abuse. Simone had been corresponding with her about a furnished apartment available for immediate occupancy, no credit check required, first month paid in cash. Corinne showed me printouts of these emails, and I felt sick reading my wife discuss me in coded language as someone she needed to escape from. Julia's responses were professional and compassionate, clearly believing she was helping someone in genuine danger. Simone had manipulated this well-meaning woman into being an accomplice in whatever she was planning. I asked Corinne what she thought Simone's endgame was, and she said based on the pattern, Simone was likely planning to disappear, file for divorce remotely through Gregory Ashford, and accuse me of abuse to justify her actions and potentially gain a favorable settlement. But Corinne said there might be more to it. She'd noticed some financial irregularities in her investigation of Simone's recent activities. Large cash withdrawals from our joint account, always just under the $10,000 threshold that would trigger bank reporting requirements. Transfers from our savings account to an account Corinne had traced to a shell company registered in Delaware. Over the past 6 months, approximately $85,000 had been moved out of our joint assets in ways that were legal but suspicious. If Simone was planning to disappear, she was taking a significant amount of our money with her. I asked if that was grounds for legal action, and Corinne said possibly, but we'd need to prove the money was moved with intent to defraud rather than just prudent financial planning. The better evidence would be catching Simone in the act of executing her plan or getting her to admit her intentions on record. I asked how we could do that, and Corinne suggested a controlled confrontation where I wore a recording device and asked Simone directly about her plans. I wasn't sure I was ready for that level of confrontation, but Corinne said we were running out of time. Based on Simone's communications with Julia Mallory, she was planning to leave within the next 2 weeks, possibly as soon as this coming Friday. If I waited too long, she'd be gone, and the accusations would start, and I'd be playing defense instead of offense. Better to control the narrative now while I still had the advantage of knowing what she was planning. I agreed reluctantly, and Corinne set me up with a small recording device that looked like an ordinary pen, but contained a microphone and digital recorder. She coached me on how to ask questions that would elicit incriminating responses, how to stay calm even if Simone became defensive or aggressive, how to keep the conversation focused on getting her to admit her plans. We practiced for an hour, role-playing different scenarios, until Corinne was satisfied I could handle it. She said to do it that evening when I got home from work, and to call her immediately afterward regardless of the outcome. I drove home that night with my heart pounding and my hands sweating on the steering wheel. The recording pen was in my shirt pocket, activated and ready. Simone's car was already in the driveway when I arrived, and I sat in my own car for 5 minutes trying to calm my breathing before going inside. I found her in the kitchen making dinner, and she greeted me with a smile and asked how my day was. I said it was fine, just the usual work stress, and asked if we could talk about something important. Her smile faltered slightly, but she nodded and suggested we sit down in the living room. I positioned myself in a chair where the recording pen would have a clear audio path to wherever she sat, and she settled onto the couch with a concerned expression, asking what was wrong. I told her I'd been noticing some strange things lately and wanted to clear the air. Cash withdrawals from our account, late meetings she'd been vague about, a storage unit I'd found a receipt for. I watched her face carefully as I spoke, seeing her expression shift from concern to wariness to something harder. Simone said the storage unit was for some of her mother's things she'd been helping to organize, and the cash was for a surprise she'd been planning for our anniversary. The explanation was smooth and immediate, rehearsed almost, but her eyes didn't match her words. I pressed harder, asking about the emails with Gregory Ashford and Julia Mallory, and her face went pale. She asked how I knew about those people, and I told her I'd hired an investigator because I needed to know what she was planning. The words hung in the air between us for a long moment, and then Simone's entire demeanor changed. The warmth drained from her expression, replaced by something cold and calculating. She asked if I was recording this conversation, and I lied and said no, I just wanted the truth. She stood up and started pacing, and I could see her mind working, trying to figure out how much I knew and how to spin it. Finally, she stopped and looked at me directly and said, yes, she'd been planning to leave me, but not for the reasons I probably thought. Simone said she'd been unhappy for years, feeling trapped in a marriage that had stopped being fulfilling or meaningful. She said I was emotionally distant, that I prioritized work over our relationship, that I dismissed her feelings whenever she tried to talk about problems between us. She said she'd tried to make it work, gone to individual therapy, read books about improving marriages, but nothing changed because I refused to acknowledge there was a problem. When she'd finally accepted that divorce was inevitable, she'd started planning how to do it in a way that would protect her financially and emotionally. The storage unit was for her belongings she wanted to keep separate. The meetings with Gregory Ashford were preliminary consultations about her legal options. The apartment in Portland was somewhere she could go to start over fresh, without the painful memories of our failed marriage surrounding her. She framed it all as self-preservation, as the actions of someone who'd tried everything else and was left with no other choice. I asked her why she needed to disappear instead of just filing for divorce like a normal person, and her face hardened. She said because she knew me, knew how I operated, knew that I'd try to control the process and make things difficult and punish her for leaving. She said the only way to protect herself was to be gone before I could mount any kind of counteroffensive. I felt anger rising in my chest and asked her what she meant by counteroffensive, and she said things like hiring investigators to dig into her private life, interrogating her about her plans, trying to paint her as the villain when she was the one who'd suffered in silence for years. I told her I'd never been violent or controlling or any of the things she was implying, and she said emotional abuse was still abuse, even if it didn't leave visible marks. She was building her narrative in real time, rewriting our marriage history to cast herself as the victim and me as the oppressor, and I could hear how convincing she sounded, even though I knew it was false. I asked Simone directly if she'd been planning to accuse me of abuse to justify her disappearance, and she hesitated just a fraction too long before saying, of course not, she'd never do that. But the hesitation betrayed her, and I knew Corinne had been right. Simone had been preparing to destroy my reputation and possibly my freedom to cover her tracks and justify her actions. I asked about the $85,000 she'd moved out of our joint accounts, and she said half of our savings was rightfully hers, and she was entitled to protect her assets. I pointed out that she'd done it secretly, in a way designed to avoid detection, and she said that was because she knew I'd try to freeze her out financially if I knew she was planning to leave. Every answer was calculated, designed to make her actions seem reasonable and my objections seem controlling. She was good at this, I realized. She'd been practicing these justifications for months, refining her victim narrative until it was seamless. The conversation went in circles for another 30 minutes, with Simone alternating between defensive explanations and subtle accusations. Finally, I told her I knew she'd been working with Diane to set up her disappearance, and Simone's eyes went wide. She asked what Diane had told me, and I said enough to know the full extent of her plan. Simone's face flushed with anger, and she said Diane had no right to betray her confidence, that she'd trusted Diane with sensitive information, and Diane had sold her out. I said Diane did the right thing by warning me before Simone could execute whatever she was planning. Simone grabbed her purse and said she needed to leave. She couldn't have this conversation right now. I asked where she was going, and she said that wasn't my concern anymore. She walked out of the house, and I heard her car start and pull out of the driveway. I sat alone in the living room with the recording pen still in my pocket, capturing every word of our confrontation. I called Corinne immediately and told her what had happened. She said to email her the recording file right away, and she'd analyze it and determine our next steps. Corinne called back 2 hours later and said the recording was gold. Simone had essentially admitted to planning her disappearance, moving money without my knowledge, consulting with a lawyer about divorce, and considering accusations of abuse as justification for her actions. None of it would necessarily hold up in a criminal trial, but it would be devastating in a divorce proceeding and would protect me from false allegations. Corinne said we needed to act fast now that Simone knew I was onto her. She'd likely accelerate her plans or change tactics, possibly becoming more aggressive with accusations to establish herself as the victim before I could establish her as the perpetrator. Corinne suggested I immediately hire a divorce attorney and file first, controlling the narrative from the beginning. She gave me the name of a lawyer named Raymond Liu, who specialized in high-conflict divorces and had experience dealing with false allegations. I called Raymond first thing the next morning and scheduled an emergency meeting for that afternoon. Raymond's office was in a high-rise downtown, and his receptionist rushed me back to his office as soon as I arrived. Raymond was in his early 50s, sharply dressed in an expensive suit, with the kind of intense focus that suggested he took every case personally. I played him the recording of my conversation with Simone and showed him all the evidence Corinne had gathered. He listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes, his expression growing graver as the full picture emerged. When I finished, Raymond said this was one of the more calculated setups he'd seen, and I was fortunate to have discovered it before Simone could execute her endgame. He said we needed to file for divorce immediately and seek emergency orders freezing all joint assets, preventing Simone from accessing shared accounts or credit cards, and establishing temporary custody of any shared property. He'd also file for a restraining order based on the evidence of Simone's plan to flee and potentially make false accusations. Raymond spent the next 3 hours drafting emergency motions and a divorce petition. He included affidavits from me and Diane, the recording transcripts, Corinne's investigative report, and copies of all the emails and financial records I'd gathered. The filing was comprehensive and devastating, laying out Simone's entire scheme in clinical legal language. Raymond said he'd file everything that afternoon and request an emergency hearing for the following day. He warned me that Simone would likely retaliate, possibly by filing her own protective order based on false allegations, and I needed to be prepared for things to get ugly. He advised me to stay with family or friends for the next few days to avoid any confrontations that Simone could use against me. I called Liam and asked if I could crash at his place for a week, and he said of course, he'd been worried about me since our first conversation about this situation. I went home that evening to pack a bag and found Simone already there, loading boxes into her car. She saw me pull up and froze, and I could see the calculation in her eyes as she decided how to play this encounter. I stayed in my truck and called Raymond, who advised me not to engage with her at all, just leave immediately. But as I was backing out of the driveway, Simone ran toward my truck and started pounding on the window, screaming that I couldn't just leave, we needed to talk. I kept driving, my hands shaking on the wheel, watching her in my rearview mirror as she stood in the middle of our street yelling. My phone started ringing immediately, Simone calling over and over, and I let every call go to voicemail. The messages she left started out angry, accusing me of running away like a coward, then shifted to desperate, begging me to come back so we could work things out, and finally turned threatening, saying I'd regret abandoning her like this. At Liam's apartment, I forwarded all the voicemails to Raymond and Corinne. Raymond said the threatening messages would support our case, and he'd include them in the emergency filing. That night, I barely slept, checking my phone obsessively for updates, jumping at every sound in Liam's apartment. Around 3 a.m, I got an alert that Simone had accessed our joint checking account and withdrawn the remaining balance, about $12,000, in clear violation of the emergency order Raymond had filed. I called him immediately, woke him up, and he said he'd amend the filing to include this violation and request sanctions. The emergency hearing was scheduled for 2 that afternoon, and Raymond said I needed to be there in person, dressed professionally, ready to testify if the judge asked me direct questions. Liam offered to come with me for moral support, and I accepted gratefully. I'd never felt more alone and vulnerable in my life. The courthouse was a gray concrete building downtown, and Raymond met me outside at 1:30. He briefed me on what to expect, how to address the judge, what kinds of questions I might be asked, and how to stay calm even if Simone or her attorney made accusations. We went through security and up to the 3rd floor where family court was held, and I saw Gregory Ashford waiting outside the courtroom with an older woman I didn't recognize. Raymond said that was probably Simone's mother, Margaret, who'd likely come to support her daughter. I wondered what Simone had told her mother about why we were here, what lies she'd spun to maintain her victim narrative. When the courtroom doors opened, we filed in and took seats at the plaintiff's table. Simone arrived 5 minutes later with Gregory Ashford, and she didn't look at me as she sat at the defendant's table. She was dressed in a conservative dress, her hair pulled back, looking vulnerable and scared, and I realized she was performing for the judge. Judge Amanda Rosewood entered, and we all stood. She was a stern-looking woman in her 60s with reading glasses perched on her nose, and a reputation, according to Raymond, for not tolerating nonsense in her courtroom. She called the case and asked Raymond to present his emergency motions. Raymond stood and outlined the situation with clarity and precision, explaining how I'd discovered my wife's plan to disappear, the evidence we'd gathered, the financial irregularities, and the threat of false accusations. He submitted all our evidence as exhibits and requested immediate orders freezing assets, preventing Simone from leaving the state, and granting me temporary exclusive use of the marital home. Gregory Ashford objected strenuously, calling our allegations outrageous and defamatory, claiming his client had every right to protect herself from a controlling and emotionally abusive husband. He said Simone had been planning to leave for her own safety, and my hiring of investigators and filing of these motions proved exactly why she'd felt the need to plan so carefully. Judge Rosewood listened to both sides without interruption, then asked to review the evidence in chambers. We waited for 30 minutes while she examined everything Raymond had submitted. When she returned, her expression was difficult to read. She said she'd reviewed the recording, the financial records, the emails, and the investigative report, and while some of the evidence could be interpreted different ways, the pattern was troubling. She was granting temporary orders, freezing all joint assets pending a full hearing, requiring both parties to maintain the status quo with their finances, and prohibiting either party from leaving the state without court permission. She was not granting the request for exclusive use of the home, saying both parties could remain there or make their own alternative arrangements. She scheduled a full hearing for 2 weeks out and dismissed us with a warning to both sides to avoid any contact except through our attorneys. As we filed out of the courtroom, I felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. The judge hadn't fully believed either of our narratives yet, but she'd at least taken the threat seriously enough to freeze our assets and prevent Simone from disappearing. Gregory Ashford stopped me in the hallway and said this was far from over, that his client had plenty of evidence of my emotional abuse and controlling behavior, and I should prepare for a very public airing of my failings as a husband. I didn't respond, just walked away with Raymond and Liam flanking me. Outside the courthouse, Raymond said the hearing had gone as well as could be expected given the circumstances. We'd successfully prevented Simone's immediate flight, and now we had 2 weeks to build an even stronger case for the full hearing. He said Corinne should continue her investigation, particularly focusing on any communications between Simone and Gregory Ashford about fabricating evidence or coaching her testimony. That kind of attorney misconduct could be grounds for sanctions and would destroy their credibility. Over the next 2 weeks, Corinne worked around the clock uncovering more details of Simone's plan. She'd found communications between Simone and a woman named Trisha Gaines, who ran a coaching service for women going through difficult divorces. Trisha's services included helping women document patterns of abuse, which essentially meant teaching them how to frame normal marital conflicts as evidence of control and violence. Simone had paid Trisha $3,000 for a 6-week course that covered how to keep journals that would support abuse allegations, how to gather evidence that could be interpreted as controlling behavior, and how to present herself as a credible victim in court. Corinne had screenshots of the course materials, which were shockingly explicit about manipulating the legal system. One module was titled, Making Your Case, How to Build a Timeline of Abuse from Everyday Interactions. Another covered, Working with Advocates, Getting Professional Support for Your Narrative. When Raymond saw this evidence, his expression turned grim. He said this was beyond typical divorce strategy and crossed into fraud and perjury territory. If Simone testified at the full hearing and made allegations of abuse based on this coached narrative, we could present evidence that she'd been systematically trained to fabricate or exaggerate claims. That would destroy her credibility and potentially expose her to criminal charges for perjury. Raymond filed a supplemental motion including Corinne's new findings and requested the judge allow expert testimony about coercive control training at the upcoming hearing. Gregory Ashford filed a furious response calling our evidence inadmissible hearsay and arguing that Simone had every right to educate herself about abuse dynamics as she processed her own trauma. The legal battle was escalating, and I felt caught in the middle of something much bigger than just our failing marriage. This had become a fight about truth versus narrative, evidence versus emotion, reality versus carefully constructed fiction. The full hearing arrived on a Monday morning, and the courthouse was busier than the emergency session had been. Raymond had prepared me extensively, warning me that I'd probably be called to testify and cross-examined by Gregory Ashford. He said to answer questions directly and honestly, not to get defensive or angry, and to remember that judges had seen countless divorces and could usually spot manipulation when it was laid out clearly. Liam came with me again, and Diane had also offered to testify if needed, having provided a sworn affidavit about Simone's requests for help with her disappearance plan. As we entered the courtroom, I saw Simone sitting with Gregory Ashford and her mother, and for the first time since this started, she looked at me directly. Her expression was wounded and disappointed, like I was the one who'd betrayed her, and I felt a flash of anger at her audacity. Judge Rosewood called the hearing to order and explained the procedures. She'd hear testimony from both sides, review all submitted evidence, and make determinations about temporary asset division, living arrangements, and any necessary protective orders. Raymond called me as his first witness, and I took the stand with my heart pounding. Raymond walked me through my version of events chronologically, discovering Diane's warning, finding the emails and financial evidence, hiring Corinne, confronting Simone, and her response. I described our marriage as generally happy until I learned about her secret planning, characterized by normal arguments and disagreements, but no pattern of control or abuse. Raymond played the recording of my confrontation with Simone, and hearing her voice in the quiet courtroom admitting to her plans and justifying her deception was surreal. When Raymond finished, Gregory Ashford stood for cross-examination, and his first question was whether I'd ever told Simone she was being irrational or overly emotional during arguments. I said probably, like most people do sometimes in frustration, but not as a pattern of dismissing her feelings. He asked if I'd ever made major financial decisions without consulting her, and I said, not that I could recall beyond normal day-to-day spending. Gregory's questions were designed to paint me as subtly controlling and dismissive, taking normal relationship dynamics and framing them as evidence of emotional abuse. He asked if I'd ever criticized Simone's spending, and I said only when we were trying to save for the house and needed to budget carefully. He asked if I'd ever questioned where she was going or who she was with, and I said occasionally when she was running late and I was worried, but not as interrogation. Each answer I gave, he twisted slightly in his follow-up questions, trying to establish a pattern that didn't exist. Raymond objected frequently, and Judge Rosewood sustained most of his objections, but I could see Gregory was building a narrative for Simone's benefit, even if the judge wasn't buying it fully. After 45 minutes of cross-examination, Judge Rosewood excused me from the stand, and I returned to sit next to Raymond, emotionally exhausted from the experience. Simone testified next, and her performance was calculated and convincing. She described years of feeling controlled and diminished, of having her concerns dismissed, of walking on eggshells to avoid my disapproval. She said I'd isolated her from friends by making subtle negative comments about them, that I'd questioned her spending in ways that made her feel like a child asking permission, that I'd tracked her location obsessively through her phone. None of it was true, but she delivered each lie with tears and trembling voice, and I could see her mother crying in the gallery. Gregory asked about her planning to leave, and Simone said she'd been terrified of how I'd react, that she'd seen my anger during arguments and knew I'd never let her go peacefully. She said the storage unit was where she'd been hiding valuables and important documents, so I couldn't destroy them in retaliation. The financial transfers were her protecting her share of our assets from my control. Working with Gregory Ashford was seeking legal advice about how to safely extract herself from an unhealthy marriage. She made herself sound like a prisoner planning an escape, and if I hadn't known the truth, I might have believed her. When Raymond cross-examined Simone, he was respectful but relentless. He asked her to identify specific instances of control or abuse, and her answers were vague and general. He asked why she'd never sought help from domestic violence organizations, if she felt genuinely unsafe, and she said she'd been too afraid and ashamed. He asked about the $85,000 she'd moved out of joint accounts, and she insisted it was her right to protect her share. Then Raymond introduced the evidence from Trisha Gaines's coaching service, and Simone's face went pale. He asked if she'd paid $3,000 to learn how to build a timeline of abuse from everyday interactions, and she said she'd taken a course to help her understand her own experiences and communicate them clearly. Raymond asked to play a video clip from one of the course modules, and Judge Rosewood allowed it. The video showed Trisha explaining how to reframe normal relationship conflicts as control tactics, how to document abuse by keeping detailed journals that emphasize the worst interpretation of a partner's behavior, and how to present your truth in a way that would be believable to professionals and courts. The video was damning, and I watched Simone's credibility crumble in real time. Judge Rosewood's expression hardened as she watched Trisha Gaines explicitly coaching women on how to manipulate the system. When the video ended, Raymond asked Simone if she'd followed these instructions when preparing her abuse allegations, and she stammered that she'd just been trying to organize her thoughts and understand what had happened to her. Raymond submitted copies of the journals Simone had been keeping, which Corinne had discovered during her investigation, and showed how they followed Trisha's template exactly. Entries that reframed my working late as abandonment, my questions about her day as interrogation, my suggestions about our budget as financial control. Every normal interaction had been weaponized and documented according to the course materials. Judge Rosewood asked to see the journals herself, and the courtroom was silent while she read through several pages. When she looked up, her expression was skeptical and disappointed. Judge Rosewood called a recess and said she needed time to review all the evidence before making her rulings. We reconvened 2 hours later, and the judge's demeanor had shifted from neutral to stern. She said she'd carefully considered the testimony and evidence from both sides, and while divorce cases often involved competing narratives, this case stood out for the extent of planning and calculation that appeared to have gone into one party's allegations. She said the evidence of financial manipulation, the secretly obtained coaching on manufacturing abuse claims, and the recorded admission of planning to disappear all painted a picture of someone attempting to defraud both the court and their spouse. Judge Rosewood granted my request for exclusive temporary use of the marital home, ordered Simone to return the $12,000 she'd withdrawn in violation of earlier orders plus sanctions, and required both parties to participate in a forensic accounting of all marital assets. She dismissed Simone's counterpetition for a protective order based on lack of credible evidence of abuse, and she ordered both parties to mediation to attempt settlement before proceeding to full trial. The ruling felt like vindication, but it didn't erase the pain of knowing my wife had been willing to destroy my life to cover her own selfish escape plan. As we left the courthouse, Gregory Ashford told Raymond his client would be appealing the judge's decisions, but Raymond said good luck with that given the evidence. Simone walked past me without looking up, her mother's arm around her shoulders, and I felt a strange mixture of anger and pity. She'd gambled on a narrative of victimhood and lost, but she'd also lost our marriage and any possibility of an amicable resolution. Over the next 3 months, we went through the formal divorce process with mediation sessions that were tense and unproductive. Simone maintained she'd been genuinely afraid of me, that the coaching course had just helped her understand her own trauma, that Raymond and I had twisted everything to make her look like a villain. The forensic accountant uncovered additional financial irregularities, including $30,000 Simone had funneled into cryptocurrency accounts under fake names, planning to access them after her disappearance. The final divorce settlement awarded me the house and the majority of our liquid assets as compensation for Simone's financial fraud. She was required to repay the money she'd hidden and moved, and she received only her portion of retirement accounts and some personal property. No alimony was awarded given her misconduct. The whole process took 8 months from the emergency hearing to the final decree, and by the end, I felt hollowed out and exhausted. Simone moved to Portland anyway, though without the dramatic disappearance she'd planned. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd told friends and family a version of the story where I'd hired lawyers and investigators to terrorize her out of pure spite, conveniently omitting her own schemes and lies. Some people believed her version, and I lost a few friends who took her side without knowing the full truth. That hurt, but I'd learned to accept that some relationships weren't worth fighting for if people were determined to believe the worst about me. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.